What if the Middle Ages had their own twisted versions of the Squid Game? Real, deadly, and sanctioned by rulers. Across the medieval world, brutal contests decided who lived, who died, and who ruled. From blood-soaked survival trials to rigged challenges dressed as justice, these games were more terrifying than fiction. But the last chapter reveals one forgotten contest so cruel and elaborate, it makes modern horrors look tame. Chapter 1. The Trial by Ordeal, God's Game of Pain. In a quiet village nestled beneath a stone abbey, the church bell tolled for judgment. A man, accused of theft, stood trembling as a crowd gathered. There would be no jury, no lawyer, no evidence. Only fire and water. He would undergo a trial by ordeal, the sacred game of pain through which God would supposedly speak. The villagers whispered prayers, but not for justice, for survival. This was not a test of truth. It was a spectacle. Fire pits glowed, water boiled, and the priest prepared the iron. The accused knew what awaited him. If his flesh blistered and bled, he was guilty. If it did not, he was spared. Yet the rules were crueler than they seemed. Even if he passed, healing took weeks, and death crept through infected wounds. The trial had already begun, not with a verdict, but with fear. And in this game, the gods stayed silent, letting pain be the only voice heard. Medieval Europe did not need proof to condemn. It needed rituals that looked holy but punished like hell. Trial by ordeal was more than justice. It was theater. These brutal games offered the illusion of fairness, wrapping savagery in sacred cloth. A woman accused of witchcraft might be bound hand and foot and tossed into a river. If she floated, she was guilty, saved by the devil. If she sank, she was innocent, but already drowned. Others had to walk barefoot across burning coals or lift scalding cauldrons from fire. Survive without injury, and God had saved you. Fail, and God had spoken. These games were not just accepted. They were revered. Churches held the tools. Priests blessed the instruments. Crowds watched like they would a festival. No one asked why God needed a human barbecue to decide the truth. They only wanted blood that looked divine. And in that hunger, cruelty turned into a game masked as righteousness. One case stands out. Elric the Miller, accused of stealing grain from a local lord. He was poor, barefoot, and had no family to defend him. His punishment was the red-hot iron ordeal. The rules were simple. Carry a piece of heated metal across a short distance. Then wait. If after 3 days your hand showed no infection, you were innocent. Elric did as told. He carried the iron while screaming in pain, the metal searing through his skin like it was butter. The priests bound his hand in holy cloth and sent him home. 3 days later they returned. The wound had festered, pus oozed from cracked skin. Verdict: guilty. Sentence: hanging. No one asked if the burn had been treated. No one asked if the iron had been heated more than usual. That wasn't the point. The pain was the game, and Elric had lost. Not because he was guilty, but because his body could not outplay fire. Trial by ordeal had many forms. Some involved water, called the cold water test. In this trial, a person would be bound and dropped into a river or lake. If they floated, it meant they were rejected by the pure water proof of guilt. If they sank, they were accepted and proven innocent. But of course, sinking often meant drowning before rescue. It was a deadly paradox. Float and die later by fire. Sink and die now in silence. This test was popular for witch accusations. Women were easy targets, especially if they were alone, poor, or midwives. The cold water ordeal painted death as divine purification. The game was rigged. God was never on your side. The crowd saw floating as proof of corruption, and sinking as sad but inevitable. Either way, the community got closure. They could sleep at night, having cleansed themselves of guilt by watching someone else suffer in God's name. Then there was the ordeal of boiling water, reserved for accusations of theft, betrayal, or insult to the clergy. The accused would plunge a hand into a pot of bubbling water to retrieve a sacred object, often a stone or ring. Once removed, the hand was bound and inspected days later. Blistering or infection meant guilt. Healing meant innocence. But the game favored those with connections. Nobles often had their hands treated secretly with salves and cooling oils before or after the act. Peasants like Elric had no such aid. To them, it was a straight ticket to death. What made it worse was the priest's role. They did not just observe. They blessed the pot. They announced the rules. And they told the crowd this was God's will. The ordeal did not seek truth. It sought submission. The act of enduring the pain was proof of obedience. Healing was just an afterthought. This wasn't about justice. It was about control. Fire held a special place in these sacred games. The ordeal of hot iron or burning plowshares was designed not only to hurt but to make a statement. You could see the flames. You could hear the sizzle. Turned pain into performance. Sometimes the accused had to walk a measured distance barefoot over heated metal. Other times they had to carry a red-hot iron bar in their hands. In both cases, the body bore the message. Nobles might turn such trials into public theater, drawing large crowds to witness their righteousness. Imagine the scene. Banners flying, choirs chanting, nobles in embroidered robes watching as peasants marched barefoot toward agony. The suffering was part of the ritual. The people needed to see it, to believe it, to feel that divine justice was present. But no miracle came, only blisters and screams. The flames never lied, but they never told the truth either. They only burned. Even children were not spared. There are records of young boys being subjected to ordeal by water for stealing bread or disturbing church grounds. In one case, a child of 10 was tied and thrown into a well to see if he would float. He did. He was beaten to death hours later. The villagers believed they had done God's work. These games were not about age, intent, or justice. They were about cleansing fear with spectacle. The more dramatic the suffering, the more satisfied the crowd. And children, with their screams and small bodies, made for powerful scenes. The innocence of youth did not protect them. It made their pain feel more redemptive. In these trials, the line between divine judgment and sadistic entertainment blurred completely. The people weren't just watching to know the truth. They were watching to feel justified in what they already believed. Pain became proof, and suffering a sermon. These ordeals were not just tools of law. They were propaganda. They reminded everyone that divine power flowed through the hands of priests and kings. By making pain the standard for truth, the system ensured that only those favored by the elite could survive. Those who healed miraculously were praised as chosen. Those who did not were cast aside as wicked. But survival often had more to do with preparation and privilege than divine favor. A wealthy noble could hide his wounds or pay a surgeon to treat them in secret. A peasant had only rags and prayers. In this way, the ordeal became a filter, not for truth but for obedience and class. The poor died, the rich passed, and everyone watching learned the same lesson. Power decides truth. These were not tests of morality. They were rituals of fear, and fear was the glue that held the medieval world together. Over time, voices of reason tried to challenge these brutal traditions. Some scholars questioned whether pain could truly reveal the soul. But these voices were drowned out by fire and spectacle. The Church defended the ordeals as divine channels, claiming that God would protect the innocent. But as centuries passed, the cracks grew. The wounds left behind were too many, the mistakes too frequent. Innocent people died while guilty ones healed. And yet, even with doubt creeping in, the games continued. Fear was stronger than doubt, pain more persuasive than philosophy, and so the trials endured. Like stage plays repeated over generations, they became a part of life. A peasant could rise in the morning, pray, plow a field, and by dusk, find himself sentenced to fire. All it took was an accusation, and once the game began, there was no way to stop it, only to burn, sink, or bleed. Eventually, by the 13th century, even the Church began to distance itself from these ordeals. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 forbade clergy from participating in trials by fire or water. This was a turning point, but not the end. Secular lords continued the practices for decades, some even centuries longer. In the backwoods and borderlands of Europe, these games survived in secret. Villages clung to them like traditions. The spectacle had become the law, and people trusted the flames more than a judge. Trials by ordeal had outlived their purpose but not their power. They had become myths, rituals, ways to make sense of a chaotic world. A world where people needed to believe that suffering could reveal truth, that pain could purify, that if someone bled or burned, they must have deserved it. These were lies wrapped in liturgy, but they were easier to accept than silence. Today, the idea seems barbaric, but in its time, it was seen as divine. That's what makes these trials so chilling. They weren't hidden crimes. They were celebrated events. People didn't just accept them. They demanded them. Communities watched their neighbors be tortured with the same enthusiasm we give modern sports. Pain became policy, death became theater. The trial by ordeal was more than law. It was a ritualized game where the prize was survival and the punishment was agony. And the worst part? Winning didn't always mean freedom. Sometimes, it just meant another day in a world where your life could be reduced to a scream in fire or a gasp beneath water. This wasn't justice. It was a medieval Squid Game in full daylight, a spectacle watched by saints and sinners alike, where the gods never answered, and the rules were always rigged. But this was just the beginning. If the Church played with pain, what happened when empires played with blood? In the next chapter, we cross into the windswept plains of the Mongol Empire, where games weren't just trials. They were executions disguised as entertainment. There, under the eyes of khans and conquerors, men fought not for truth but for survival, and losing meant feeding the earth with your bones. Before we continue to Chapter 2, let me know if you're enjoying this kind of long, gentle history. Feel free to tap that like button and subscribe, only if you truly love what I'm doing here. And in the comments, Share where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your city. I always love seeing our little bedtime crew gathering from every corner of the world. Now, lower your lights. Maybe let a soft fan hum in the background and settle in. Let's proceed with tonight's quiet journey together. Chapter 2: Gladiators of the Steppe. The Mongol Death Matches. The wind howled over the open steppes like a warning. But in the Mongol camps, it was drowned out by the sound of hooves, shouting warriors, and drums pounding for blood. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongol Empire stretched farther than any land-based empire in history. But while they are remembered for military brilliance and ruthless efficiency, the Khans also had a taste for games. Brutal games. Death matches were held not just to punish or entertain, but to control. These contests tested loyalty, sorted the weak from the strong, and reminded everyone who truly ruled the world. Captives, criminals, and even soldiers were forced into makeshift arenas carved into the dirt, surrounded by nobles wrapped in fur and gold. The rules were simple: survive, kill or be killed. No tricks, no mercy. And as the crowd roared, the steppe turned red. What started as conquest became ritual, and death was the coin tossed into the dirt. In one chilling account from the reign of Ogidi Khan, a group of Persian prisoners, scholars, merchants, and warriors were selected after a city fell. The generals brought them before the court and asked a single question: who among them would fight for their lives? Those who volunteered were given weapons. Those who refused were tied to stakes and made into spectators. The volunteers were thrown into an open pit, surrounded by cheering warriors and the watching Khan. The first to die was a merchant, untrained but desperate. His blood soaked the sand as the others backed into corners. The fighting was clumsy, chaotic, and full of screams. But that was part of the spectacle. This was not about skill. It was about raw instinct. Those who hesitated died. Those who struck first survived. At the end, only 2 remained. The Khan made them fight again, and when one finally stood alone, he was spared, but not truly free. He would fight again tomorrow. The Mongols were not merely warlords. They were showmen. Public death games served as lessons. In newly conquered lands, these matches were used to teach fear, to break spirits, to force obedience. Locals were made to watch their champions or family members slaughtered before Mongol judges. This was psychological warfare with a drumbeat. Some matches pitted Mongol soldiers against prisoners in uneven duels. Sometimes they forced prisoners to fight each other blindfolded, to amuse commanders after a feast. To the Khans, entertainment and punishment were not opposites. They were 2 sides of the same coin. One event in the Darim Basin saw captured Chinese archers forced into knife combat in front of their surviving comrades. Those who fought hardest were kept as living warnings. Those who died fed the fire of Mongol legend. This was the Squid game of the steppe. Every victory a survival, every defeat a message, and every participant a pawn in someone else's performance. What made these games even more terrifying was the uncertainty. There were no promises, no written rules. One day, a soldier might be promoted for bravery. The next, he could be tested for loyalty in a fight to the death. In the court of Monk Khan, a trusted bodyguard was once accused of betrayal. Instead of a trial, he was ordered to fight 3 prisoners barehanded. If he survived, he would be forgiven. If he died, his guilt would be confirmed. This logic made sense in Mongol minds. They believed that fate revealed truth through action. If you won, perhaps you deserved to live. But these contests were rarely fair. Sometimes opponents were drugged. Sometimes weapons were sabotaged. The goal was not balance. It was display, to show power, to amuse the court, and to remind everyone watching that their life could be turned into a game at any moment. Not because of guilt, but because someone needed a show. Soldiers, too, were not exempt from these twisted rites. In the Mongol military hierarchy, glory came at a cost. Promotions were tied to bravery, but also to endurance. During some ceremonies, rival captains were ordered to fight each other with wooden swords before an audience of generals. Wounds were expected, humiliation was common. It was part of the spectacle. A bruised, bleeding face proved commitment. A broken nose proved sacrifice. These games built loyalty through suffering. No one dared refuse for fear of being labeled weak or disloyal. In rare cases, the losers were executed, especially if they insulted their opponent or showed cowardice. These mock duels blurred the line between game and punishment, and though some laughed, others cried behind their helmets, not because of pain, but because they knew what it meant. This was how the Mongols maintained their empire, not just through fear of the sword, but fear of the arena, a place where friends became enemies and survival meant violence. There were also the Naadam festivals, where wrestling and archery were celebrated. But even these had dark edges. While often remembered as sports, they could easily become brutal contests when used for political purposes. A general could request a match between two rivals to settle a dispute. Sometimes, these matches ended with broken limbs, crushed throats, or ruptured skulls. Even the youth were not spared. Teenage boys were thrown into arenas to wrestle until one gave up or stopped breathing. It was called training, but it felt more like weeding out the weak. These weren't random games. They were structured violence, made palatable with tradition. It gave the Khans the illusion of fairness, even when outcomes were decided before the first blow. And those watching saw what the empire wanted them to see: strength, order, and submission. The blood on the sand wasn't a stain. It was a message written in flesh, a language everyone understood, even if they could not read. Not all fights were public. In remote outposts, whispers told of circle tests, where 5 or 6 prisoners were chained together, armed with blades and thrown into a ring. Only one could leave. Sometimes they were promised food, other times freedom, but often the promise was a lie. The survivor was executed anyway. This was not about reward, it was about decay, a way to test how far men would go to live, how quickly they would turn on one another. In one chilling account near the Caspian Sea, a group of Slavic prisoners was given weapons and told the winner would be freed. They fought for hours. The last man standing wept, asking for mercy. The commander laughed and ordered his throat cut. It was never a game. It was theater. These moments were shared around campfires, told in hushed tones, not as warnings but as legends. And so, even in silence, the steppe echoed with screams that never left the soil. Among the Mongols, performance and power fed each other. The more dramatic the display, the greater the respect. Killing an enemy in battle was honorable. Killing him in front of a crowd, slowly, with flair, was glorious. These values seeped into every layer of the empire. A captured nobleman might be given a bow and 1 arrow, then told to face 10 archers. If he survived, he could live. If not, his death fed the laughter of a Khan's court. This wasn't random cruelty, it was engineered hierarchy. Those at the top decided who would play. Those at the bottom were the pieces, and everyone in between watched, wondering when their turn would come. The arena wasn't just a circle in the dirt. It was the empire itself. The world was a game board, and blood was the currency. In this system, mercy was weakness, entertainment was proof of strength, and death, repeated, ritualized death, was the final applause. Some warriors turned the death games to their advantage. One such man was Tudor, a captured Chinese mercenary. Instead of begging, he fought in each forced match with ferocity. His survival won the attention of a Khan, who offered him command of a small unit. But this rise came with a cost. To earn full status, he had to kill his former comrade in a staged duel. The court watched as the two circled each other in silence, one trying to survive, the other trying to escape. Tudor won, but his eyes never lifted from the corpse. Even in victory, he was not free. He was simply useful. The Mongol death matches rewarded brutality, but they stole the soul. Tudor lived, but he carried the weight of every strike. Every crowd's cheer echoed in his nightmares. This was not redemption. It was transformation. A man becoming monster, shaped by a game he never chose to play. The death matches served multiple purposes. They punished rebellion, entertained leaders, and trained soldiers in real-world cruelty. But they also ensured compliance. In every city they conquered, the Mongols used public execution and staged duels to break resistance. They offered survival not through surrender, but through participation. A captive could either join the slaughter or become part of it. This broke morale faster than starvation or siege. Cities fell not just to siege engines, but to fear of what followed. Parents told their children to obey because they remembered the pits, the blades, the crowds. Even centuries later, stories of these games survived. Not as myths, but as warnings passed down from bloodline to bloodline. They were the silent laws of an unwritten empire, one where life was temporary, loyalty was disposable, and games were always deadly. The Mongols didn't just conquer lands. They conquered the will to resist, and they did it with a laugh and a sword. In the grand courts of the Golden Horde, beneath banners soaked with wind and war, these brutal matches became tradition, not written in law, but embedded in custom. Elders recalled them as tests of honor. Survivors remembered only the terror. But they all agreed on one thing: when the Khan wanted blood, someone would be chosen. The empire thrived on performance, on submission, on fear packaged as spectacle. Every death was proof of power. Every survivor a walking tribute to cruelty. These were not mindless executions. They were games with shifting rules where only the Khans knew the end. And that's what made them so terrifying. You could follow every order, swear every oath, and still be thrown into the pit for sport. Because in the Mongol world, life was not sacred. It was entertaining, and the game was never truly over, just waiting for the next player to be called. Chapter 3: The Black Tournament, France's vicious game of honor. In the heart of 14th century France, under the banners of nobility and the shadow of civil unrest, a gathering took shape that blurred the line between ceremony and slaughter. It was called the Black Tournament. Beneath its chivalric veil, it promised honor. What it delivered was carnage. Hosted during a time when the French crown teetered between rival factions, the tournament became a twisted method of deciding political favor. Knights arrived from all corners, drawn by ambition and desperation. There were no clear rules, no limits on weapons or force. It was said that armor clanged louder than church bells, and the cries of the dying echoed longer than prayers. The noble lords in attendance smiled from their high towers, watching as men spilled blood over imagined ideals. But this was never about chivalry. It was about survival. The Black Tournament turned honor into a gamble, where each duel became a coin toss between glory and mutilation. It began as a spectacle, orchestrated by a duke desperate to secure favor with the crown. France was fractured, nobles at each other's throats, and alliances were built on blood. The tournament offered a public show of loyalty, but what played out was something else entirely. Dozens of knights, young, old, famous, forgotten, gathered in the valley outside Lyon. The grounds were dressed like a festival. Flags waved, crowds formed, trumpets sang. But the air carried something darker. Whispers of bribed referees. Rumors that outcomes had already been purchased. Duels were not evenly matched. Rivals were thrown against each other to settle old grudges. Many entered with dreams of honor. Few left with their lives intact. And for the watching nobility, it was all a chessboard. Each fallen knight removed one more obstacle. Each victory earned not only cheers but a place at the political table. Those who survived did so with more scars than glory, and some would never walk again. Among the contestants was Sir Lambert of Artois, a minor noble whose family's name had faded with time. He came armored in hope, desperate to reclaim his family's lost honor. His first match was against a seasoned knight, twice his size, rumored to have killed men in duels even outside the field. The crowd expected a slaughter, but Lambert was faster, more desperate, and when he disarmed his opponent and drove a blade through his leg, the nobles stirred. He was suddenly noticed, elevated. That victory bought him favor from one faction and hatred from another. By the second day, he was ambushed during a match. His opponent ignored the surrender. Lambert's arm was broken, his helmet smashed, his visor torn off. He survived only because a noblewoman intervened. But the message was clear. This was not a fair tournament. It was a web of schemes where knights were pawns. And in this game, honor was the bait. Death was the prize. The Black Tournament was different from traditional justs or staged combat. It carried no ceremonial order, no referees to halt the blow. Duels began with drawn swords and ended in blood-soaked mud. Contestants were given vague rules that changed with each round. One fight allowed shields, the next forbade them. Some duels were declared to the death without warning. Spectators cheered not for skill, but for savagery. A clean kill was a disappointment. They wanted torn throats, shattered knees, brutal finales. The nobles in silk robes clapped behind their masks, using the chaos to test the value of warriors, to scout future vassals, or simply to indulge their bloodlust. Betting was rampant. Gold changed hands faster than swords clashed. And in the center of it all were men dying for a title that meant little in a land ruled by corruption. It wasn't victory that kept them fighting. It was the chance, however slim, to climb out of obscurity on a ladder made of corpses. By the fourth day, the tournament grounds looked more like a battlefield than a festival. Blood stained the grass. Makeshift tents became field hospitals, filled with groaning men, some missing eyes, others with splintered bones or punctured lungs. Yet the games continued. The noble hosts announced a new twist: group combat. Teams of knights, allied by choice or forced by lords, were to fight in a confined arena until only one group stood. What followed was chaos. Alliances shattered mid-battle. Friends turned on each other. The mud became thick with gore. One knight was trampled beneath a horse and left to suffocate. Another was beheaded while pleading for surrender. There was no pause.
No merci.
Just a deafening roar from the crowd. The nobles laughed as their favorites advanced. Their enemies bled into the earth. What was once a tournament of valor had become a proxy war. An elegant, murderous game where power was won not through law, but through survival. Whispers spread that some matches were fixed not by coin, but by poison and sabotage. Knights found their armor tampered with, straps loosened, blades dulled. One man was found dead before his match, his wine laced with belladonna. Officials turned blind eyes. The sponsors, wealthy dukes and barons, wanted blood, not justice. This was not a test of chivalry. It was a gauntlet. Those who navigated it had to fight both in the ring and outside it. A surviving knight had to battle not just swords, but spies, informants, and bribes. It was a political theater masked as martial glory, and everyone knew it, yet no one left. The risk was high, but so was the reward. A winner could walk away with land, a title, or a marriage into a noble house. All it took was killing the right person and avoiding the wrong ones. The Black Tournament was not a celebration. It was a trap, and every knight was already inside. Sir Lambert fought again on the final day, this time against a rival supported by a major noble house. He knew he would not win, not because he lacked skill, but because the outcome had already been decided. Still, he entered the ring, bloodied and limping, with a borrowed sword. The crowd had turned against him. They wanted him broken. As blades clashed, he landed a blow that cut across his opponent's chest. But instead of cheers, a signal came from the stands. The other knight ignored all protocol and drew a dagger, stabbing Lambert in the thigh, then again in the side. Lambert fell, no one intervened. The nobles watched in silence. A moment later, he was dead. The victor bowed, drenched in blood, and was rewarded with a new title and a castle. Lambert's body was carried out like meat. No funeral, no songs, just silence. Another player discarded. Another victory decided long before the first strike. For those who survived, the rewards were real, but so were the scars. Knights returned home missing limbs or vision. Some never spoke again, haunted by the betrayal of their so-called brothers in arms. Others found themselves entangled in noble debts, trapped in political schemes they didn't understand. The Black Tournament was not a step up. It was a trapdoor. Victory meant entanglement, failure meant death. And even survivors were pawns in greater games. Their families were sometimes used as leverage. Land grants came with impossible obligations. No one left clean. The nobles, of course, emerged untouched. They clinked goblets, sealed marriages, and redrew alliances based on who lived and who died. Their tournament had served its purpose. Blood had been spilled, power had shifted, and honor had been sacrificed on an altar of ambition. The fields were cleared, the tents packed, but the memory of what happened there would echo through generations as a warning. Years later, the Black Tournament became legend. Ballads were written, twisting the events into tales of glory. But those who were there remembered the truth. It wasn't a noble contest. It was a political massacre, an experiment in manipulation and spectacle. It laid bare how easily the ideals of knighthood could be used to justify carnage, how war could be disguised as entertainment, how honor could be weaponized, and how men could be fooled into thinking they were heroes when they were only tools. The tournament never repeated on that scale again, but its shadow loomed over every duel and every court. It showed that when the powerful grow bored or afraid, they create games. Games where the pawns believe they matter, where blood spills not for justice, but for applause. The Black Tournament was not an anomaly. It was a warning that the most dangerous game is the one you think is noble until the blade is at your throat. In France, the scars of that brutal contest faded into myths, but its mechanics, rigged contests, power plays, deadly rewards, continued to echo through time. The Black Tournament was a perfect mirror of a fractured kingdom, a place where violence was dressed in ritual and death was mistaken for glory. It was a medieval Squid game without walls, a rolling battlefield where ambition masked itself in chivalry. Its legacy lived on not in the songs of victory, but in the nightmares of those who survived. And as France slid deeper into civil war, other tournaments rose in its image, smaller, quieter, but no less bloody. Because once blood becomes entertainment, it never stays on the ground. It gets into the walls, into the soul. And like the knights of that forgotten field, all who entered were marked forever, not as heroes, but as players who learned too late that the game was never fair. It was only fatal. Chapter 4: The Blood Games of Mesoamerica, Warriors as Wagers. In the ancient cities of Mesoamerica, beneath towering temples and the gaze of stone gods, the blood games began. To the untrained eye, they looked like duels, gladiators facing off beneath the scorching sun, their muscles tense, their weapons sharp. But these games were never fair. They were rigged from the start. Prisoners of war, stripped of armor, were forced into combat against elite warriors in front of roaring crowds. The priests called it sacred. The kings called it balance. The spectators called it thrilling. But for the men trapped in the ring, it was a sentence. These blood games were wagers dressed as rituals, where life was gambled for the amusement of rulers and the satisfaction of gods. Each fight followed an unwritten script. The captive was allowed to strike, to dodge, to hope, but the outcome was sealed before the first blow. Even if he won the crowd, he would never win his life. That was the secret of the game. The Aztecs perfected these spectacles. Captured warriors, often the finest of their defeated enemies, were paraded through the streets before their final day. They were honored as worthy opponents, but it was a cruel courtesy. They were destined to fight in the Tlahuanaliztli, the gladiatorial sacrifice. In the center of the sacred plaza, a prisoner would be tied by one foot to a stone platform. Around him, elite jaguar and eagle warriors circled, each armed with sharpened obsidian blades. The prisoner was given a wooden club. His opponents wielded weapons capable of splitting bone. The crowd chanted, the priest sang, the fight began. The captive swung wildly, landing desperate blows. For a moment, the crowd roared in admiration. But it was only a delay. One by one, the jaguar warriors closed in, striking with precision, cutting with brutal skill. The captive collapsed under the weight of inevitable defeat. And when the final blow came, the stone beneath him turned red. These were not random executions. The blood games served a cosmic purpose in Mesoamerican belief. Every drop of blood spilled was an offering to the gods, a payment to keep the sun moving and the seasons turning. But even this divine logic masked something darker. The ruling class used these games as public theater, a way to parade power and crush enemies. By forcing captured warriors to fight impossible battles, they humiliated rival tribes and reminded the people who controlled life and death. The priests claimed the captives died with honor, but their fates were sealed before their names were announced. Even if a prisoner fought with skill, even if he knocked a jaguar warrior to the ground, the result never changed. The cycle was fixed. Survival was not part of the script. The gods demanded blood. The kings demanded control. And the people demanded a show. In the blood games, all three were satisfied. Some prisoners became legends. Stories spread of captives who defied the odds, who fought with such fury that they forced the games to stretch longer than intended. One such man, taken from a rival kingdom, survived against 3 elite warriors in a single session. The crowd roared with each of his defiant strikes. The priests hesitated. The captors considered mercy, but it was a mirage. No prisoner ever left the ring alive. When the 4th warrior stepped in, the crowd's cheers turned into silence. The man fell, his wooden club shattered, his body torn by obsidian blades. His spirit was celebrated, but his life was never his own to keep. The blood games were designed to offer hope, but only briefly. That fleeting hope made the spectacle more intoxicating. The audience could watch the struggle, pretend the outcome was uncertain, and feel the thrill of possibility. But the gods had already made their wager, and the house always won. The duels were only one part of the blood games. In some regions, entire teams of prisoners were pitted against smaller groups of elite warriors in ceremonial ball games. These were not playful contests. The ball was heavy, the arena narrow, and the walls unforgiving. The stakes were life itself. Prisoners were allowed to compete with limited protection, while their opponents wore padded armor and carried hidden blades. If the prisoners scored, the crowd erupted. But the referees were nobles, and the rules shifted like sand. Victories were often dismissed as accidents, and penalties were called without reason. The games always led to the same ending: public sacrifice. The losing team, or sometimes both teams, were led to the temple steps, where their chests were torn open as the sun rose. Some historians argue the ball games had deeper spiritual meaning. But beneath the symbolism, the games were brutally efficient tools of control. They entertained, they unified, and they fed the gods. It was not just warriors who were wagered. Sometimes entire villages, conquered and absorbed into empires, were used as living currency in these games. The captives were marched hundreds of miles, paraded before cities that had never seen them. They were given weapons for the arena but no real chance to win. Their deaths became political signals, reminders to rival kingdoms of what awaited them. In Tenochtitlan, festivals stretched for days, where the blood games consumed prisoner after prisoner in a cycle of sacrifice that fed both the gods and the ruling class. Spectators dressed in feathers and gold. Priests wore skull masks and carried obsidian knives. The smell of sweat, smoke, and blood filled the air. For the rulers, it was a perfect system. Enemies were killed in a spectacle that reinforced divine order. The crowds left satisfied. The sun was believed to rise again because the blood debt had been paid. And the games always had more players. In smaller city-states, variations of these blood games appeared with local flavors. In some, captives were forced to run gauntlets through crowds armed with sticks and stones. Survival was unlikely. In others, prisoners were tied to posts and allowed to dodge projectiles hurled by elite warriors. It was called a test of agility, but the real purpose was humiliation. The outcome was always a death designed for public consumption. Even when the contests appeared balanced, the odds were stacked. Sharp weapons on one side, dull clubs on the other. Armor against bare skin. Trained warriors against desperate men. Yet the games always drew crowds, because even in their cruelty they were mesmerizing. The captives became living stories, their struggles painted on murals, their final moments carved into temple walls. They became symbols of power, courage, and inevitability. And though their names were often forgotten, their blood never was. It remained in the stones, in the soil, and in the memory of those who watched. Some rulers used the blood games as political tools, sending subtle messages to their rivals through the treatment of captives. If a king wanted to humiliate an enemy, he might allow that enemy's warriors to fight with sharpened weapons, only to be executed immediately after winning. In other cases, prisoners were promised freedom if they survived, a lie that bought fierce battles and spectacular performances. The audience, drunk on the illusion of hope, cheered louder for those who believed they could escape. But the promise was always broken. In one recorded festival, a warrior survived multiple rounds, was offered his life, and then sacrificed as the sun set. His blood was a punctuation mark in a sentence that had already been written. The priests claimed it was the will of the gods, but behind closed doors, it was the will of kings, of nobles, of men who understood that control was easier when dressed as destiny. Among the most brutal spectacles was the multi-stage blood game known in some regions as the Path of the Jaguar. Prisoners were forced to complete a series of near-impossible tasks, outrunning elite warriors, defeating chained animals, and surviving solo combat in staged arenas. Each stage promised survival if completed, but each stage drained the prisoner of strength, leaving them exhausted for the next. The final duel was always unwinnable. A rested jaguar knight, armored and precise, against a bleeding, broken man. Yet the prisoners fought with astonishing willpower, sometimes knocking their opponents to the ground, sometimes drawing gasps from the crowd. But the games had no alternate ending. When the final blade fell, the crowd erupted, not in sorrow, but in satisfaction. They had seen the struggle, the courage, the inevitable collapse. And in that collapse, they found their entertainment. The Path of the Jaguar became a story told in hushed reverence, a tale of resistance that only ever ended in sacrifice. Even children were drawn into the orbit of these deadly games. Boys watched the captives fight and imagined themselves as warriors. Some practiced with wooden swords, dreaming of becoming the ones who circled the stone platform, not the ones tied to it. The blood games taught them lessons. Power is spectacle, struggle is inevitable, death is ritual. Over time, the games shaped not just politics but the psychology of an empire. They created a world where the line between sacred duty and savage entertainment disappeared, where courage was expected, but mercy was not. The priests maintained that these spectacles were necessary to sustain the universe, to feed the gods, to prevent cosmic collapse. But they also fed the ambitions of kings, the egos of warriors, and the hunger of crowds. In this system, everyone played a role. Some as gladiators, some as executioners, most as spectators. And none could claim to be innocent. In rare moments, captives forced their stories into the cracks of history. Some fought with such skill that their names were carved into stone. Some died so defiantly that the priests hesitated. But hesitation was brief. The wheel of ritual continued to turn. Even when warriors survived the arena, they were usually sacrificed at the temple steps. The blood games never allowed true victory. They only offered the illusion of choice. Fight well and die. Fight poorly and die faster. The system thrived because it promised drama and delivered death. And the audience returned again and again, eager to witness the next legend rise and fall. The stones of the arenas grew slick with the blood of those who played. And though the empires would later fall to foreign conquerors, the memory of these games endured, whispered by survivors, etched into ruins, and buried beneath layers of soil and time. In the end, the blood games of Mesoamerica were not simply contests. They were machines. Machines that converted prisoners into power, blood into order, death into spectacle. They blurred the sacred and the savage, folding politics and faith into a single violent ritual. For the rulers, the games offered a way to maintain dominance. For the priests, they provided cosmic balance. For the people, they were irresistible theater. But for the captives, they were a cruel wager where the dice were always loaded. Even those who fought like legends were simply feeding a system that had no mercy. The games were never about freedom. They were never about survival. They were about control. And in this ancient Squid game, the final move had already been made long before the first warrior stepped into the ring. The players were many. The winners were none. Chapter 5: The Bone Pit Lottery, Plague Games in 14th Century Italy. The Black Death came with no warning, no mercy, and no understanding. Town after town in 14th century Italy fell into silence, their streets choked with the dead. The smell of decay settled over the cities like a second skin. Panic replaced reason. The sick were walled into homes. Priests died faster than they could give last rites. Entire families vanished in a week, and in the terror of that chaos, a dark idea took root. In a hilltop town outside Florence, a twisted solution was proposed. To protect the healthy, they would draw names. A lottery. The chosen would be sealed in deep plague pits, bone pits, under the belief that containing the infected would spare the rest. But the names weren't always sick. Sometimes they were inconvenient, suspected, poor, or just unlucky. They were dragged from their homes, screaming, praying, clawing, thrown into pits beneath the earth, buried alive in the name of survival. And the town slept, thinking itself righteous. The decision came from a small council of elders, wealthy merchants and churchmen who believed they held divine wisdom. They argued that fate was God's will, so why not use fate as their weapon? Every few nights, names were written on scraps of parchment. These were dropped into an urn. A child would draw them blindly. The ritual gave it legitimacy, a twisted parody of justice. Some families bribed their way out. Others vanished before their names could be called. But most were powerless. The chosen were rounded up at dawn. No trial, no proof of illness, just suspicion. They were told it was for the good of all. Then marched to the edge of town, to an old quarry repurposed for death. The pits were deep, the walls steep. Once dropped in, there was no escape. The living were buried with the dying. And all the while, the town continued its business, pretending it had done something noble. Some who fell into the pits were not yet sick. They arrived breathing, coughing only from panic, not plague. But sealed underground with the infected, they didn't stay healthy long. The pit became a nightmare, half tomb, half prison. The air thickened with rot. Moans echoed into the darkness. The dying clung to the living. Hunger turned men feral. The ground was wet with blood, bile, and filth. Bones snapped in fights over moldy bread tossed down as a token gesture. Some tried to dig their way out, clawing at the stone with bare hands. Others whispered prayers until their lips stopped moving. At night, the cries grew louder. They pleaded, begged, cursed the names of those who sent them there. But no one came. The town guards patrolled with torches, daring no one to approach. The bone pit was no longer just a solution, it was a spectacle. And in a sick twist, it became entertainment for the fearful. Atop the ridge, people watched. They said they came to make sure the sealed stayed sealed. But in truth, they came to feel safe. Powerful, removed. Mothers held children close as the cries rose. Some brought wine, sipping as if at a theater. The moans became background music. The death rattle a chorus. It numbed them, made the horror distant. By watching, they convinced themselves it was necessary, that the lottery had worked, that they had beaten the plague by outsmarting it. But it was a lie. The death continued, the sickness spread. And deep down, they knew it. The lottery wasn't about containment. It was about control, about redirecting fear into order, into spectacle. As long as people believed there was a system, even a cruel one, they could keep living, keep breathing, keep pretending. So they watched, some wept, others laughed. But no one stopped it, because to stop it would mean facing the truth, that they had traded justice for survival. One survivor would later tell a chilling tale, scrawled in a hidden journal found years later in a church wall. He claimed he escaped the pit by hiding beneath corpses, waiting for a guard shift, then climbing the slick stone with bloodied fingers. He crawled back to the village, broken and starved. But when the townspeople saw him, they turned on him like he was the plague itself. He was not a man. He was a ghost. A reminder. They beat him, locked him in a cart, drove him far into the woods and abandoned him. Whether he lived or died was unknown. But his story lived on, whispered in corners, passed in shameful silence. It proved what the town feared most, not the sickness, but its own reflection. The pit had become their measure of mercy, and this man had broken the illusion. He had lived, and that made him dangerous, because if one could escape, then so could their conscience. The church rang its bells and held masses for the dead, but never for those in the pit. They were nameless now, unclean. Officially, the town declared them martyrs, quiet sacrifices to protect the whole. But the truth gnawed at the edges of every sermon. The churchmen knew. Some had drawn the names. Others had watched the drop. They confessed only in whispers, to stone statues and locked doors. The pits were still growing. Some were sealed completely. Others were covered lightly with dirt and stone, still breathing beneath the surface for days. Rats swarmed, insects bred, and still the elders told the people to trust the system, to draw more names, to believe, because belief was safer than rebellion. They could not risk the collapse of order, not now. So the pits deepened, the lotteries continued, and the town rotted from the inside. Faith became fear, hope became compliance, and the line between justice and murder dissolved into dust. Elsewhere in Italy, rumors spread of other towns doing the same. In the chaos of the Black Death, stories bloomed like mold. Some real, some imagined. In one Tuscan village, it was said that the dead were dressed in fine clothes and paraded through the square before being tossed into the pit. Mock funerals for condemned innocents. In another, survivors were forced to draw their own names, and some claimed they saw townspeople cheering as plague wagons rolled by, tossing victims in like garbage. Whether true or not, these stories painted a picture of desperation turned savage. Communities consumed by survival instinct. Fear had shredded every moral thread. What mattered now was not truth, but control. And the more grotesque the ritual, the more comforting it felt. Because if you could name the sacrifice, you didn't have to be it. If you could watch the pit close, you could pretend it sealed away the fear itself. But it never did. Eventually, the plague burned itself out. It always did. The town reopened, the shops returned, fields were tilled, children played again. But the bone pit remained, covered with stones, unmarked, no monument, no plaque, just silence. The council that had orchestrated the lottery quietly dissolved. Some died of natural causes. Others vanished. The town chose not to remember. It was easier that way. But the pit remembered. Rainwater washed through the rocks. Bones shifted below. At night, the wind howled across the quarry like a funeral hymn. Some said they heard voices. Others refused to speak of it at all. But everyone knew where it was. Where not to build. Where not to walk. It became a scar beneath the surface. Not just in the earth, but in the people. Passed down in glances, in superstitions, in bedtime warnings. The pit had fed the plague with blood, and the town had lived. But what it buried was not just bodies. It was itself. Years later, a traveler uncovered fragments of parchment near the site. Faded names, scrawled dates, a child's handwriting, the lottery. Scholars dismissed it as local folklore. Historians wrote around it, afraid to face what it suggested. That in the face of annihilation, even good people could become monsters with ballots. That mercy was not lost in battle, but willingly sacrificed on altars of fear. The documents were stored, filed, and mostly ignored. Too uncomfortable, too bleak. Yet the story resurfaced from time to time, fuel for plays, whispers in plague journals, cautionary tales in dusty classrooms. But no one ever rebuilt the town. It remained perched on its hill, its population never recovering. And beneath it, The earth never stopped shifting. The pit waited, its memory etched in silence, a place where chance became judgment, where justice was drawn from a child's hand, and where the only rule was simple: don't be chosen, because once your name was called, the game was already over. The most disturbing thing about the Bone Pit lottery wasn't its cruelty. It was its logic. In a world unraveling, the townspeople created rules, however warped, to restore order. They framed murder as necessity, framed fear as faith, and in doing so, turned the plague into a stage for something worse. A game where survival was pitted against humanity. It asked a question more terrifying than death. What would you do to stay alive? And the answer came not in swords or rebellion, but in ink, in paper, in quiet votes dropped into an urn. It was bureaucracy turned lethal, a game of numbers, a ritual of silence, and it worked, not because it cured the plague, but because it distracted people long enough to forget what they were becoming. The pit was their solution, their sacrifice, their scapegoat, but in the end, it was their reflection. And once they looked away, it stayed behind. A game with no winner, only victims. The Bone Pit lottery was not a myth. It was not a metaphor. It was real. In some form, it happened more than once, in more than one place. Because fear is contagious. And when death knocks, people don't just panic. They plan. They rationalize, they play games. Games where names are drawn, where cries are ignored, where silence becomes complicity. The lottery offered the illusion of fairness. The pit offered closure. Together, they gave birth to one of the most grotesque truths of the medieval world: that survival can be weaponized, that randomness can be made sacred, and that, in the face of plague, humanity can be made to draw straws for its own execution. The pit is gone now, the town forgotten, but the story remains, a buried memory, half legend, half nightmare. A reminder that the most brutal game of the medieval period wasn't fought with swords. It was decided with parchment, and played by everyone. Chapter 6: The 100 Scars Trial, Samurai Games of Endurance. In the rigid world of feudal Japan, loyalty was everything. A samurai's honor was stitched into obedience, bound to his lord like a shadow. But sometimes words were not enough. Declarations of loyalty had to be proven. And so the daimyos, the powerful warlords of the time, devised a test. A ritual of torment disguised as tradition. They called it the 100 Scars Trial. It was said to separate the loyal from the weak, the devoted from the pretenders. But in truth, it was a cruel performance, a test not of strength or skill, but of submission. The warrior had to endure pain, deliberate, humiliating, and public. Each scar, a stamp of allegiance. The more he bled without screaming, the deeper his devotion was believed to be. It was a performance for the Lord's amusement. A game of agony that could elevate a man or destroy him. And in this game, surviving was never the same as winning. The trial began in silence. The chosen samurai would kneel in a garden, stripped to the waist, surrounded by his fellow retainers. His lord sat high above, expressionless, observing like a judge awaiting the first cry. There were no chants, no speeches, just the scent of incense and the crackle of flame. The first ordeal was small, ashes from burning sandalwood pressed into the skin until they seared black. Then, tiny blades thin as reeds, drawn across the forearms in slow, precise lines. The goal wasn't to kill, it was to control. Each cut was measured, spaced, counted 10, then 20, then 30. The warrior was expected to remain still, to breathe evenly, to not flinch. One flinch, and the trial would pause, not to stop the pain, but to shame the body's betrayal. Every movement was judged. Every tremble was a mark of disgrace. And all the while the Lord watched, not with compassion, but with anticipation. The 100 scars were not literal in number. The term was symbolic, each mark a vow, a signature in blood. As the trial progressed, the tests escalated. Burning incense sticks were placed directly on the skin and left to smolder. The back, the thighs, the chest. The smell of burning flesh hung heavy in the air. Sometimes the samurai's own comrades were tasked with administering the pain. Their hands trembled, not from guilt, but from fear. Refusing to participate would mean suspicion. In this test, everyone played a part. The tormentors, the witnesses, the Lord, and the victim. Once the flesh was burned, the blades returned, this time to carve symbols, characters of loyalty, or simply lines to count the agony. Some samurai passed out. Others vomited quietly, but they were not removed, revived, forced to kneel again. Pain was not the enemy. Resistance was, and anyone who failed to finish the trial vanished soon after, stripped of rank, or worse, of life. One of the most infamous accounts tells of a young samurai from Kyushu. He was accused of whispering doubts about his lord's campaign. No proof, only suspicion. As punishment, he was summoned to the garden at dawn. What made his trial different was the presence of nobles, guests from allied clans. It became a spectacle. The Lord, eager to display discipline, extended the ritual. The samurai endured 50 cuts without a sound. But during the incense burns, he flinched, twitch barely visible. Yet the executioner paused. The crowd grew silent. The Lord stood, signaling a change. The next ordeal involved blade dancing. The warrior had to walk barefoot across a platform of raised, sharpened steel while balancing a torch above his head. Blood poured from his sawls. He staggered once, then again. He did not fall, but it didn't matter. After the trial, he was dismissed with honor in public, and quietly found dead 2 days later in his chamber. A loyal corpse. To outsiders, the 100 Scars trial seemed barbaric. But to the samurai caste, it was woven into the very code they lived by. Bushido demanded honor, loyalty, and endurance. This trial twisted those values into a cruel theater. And because the warrior's identity was built on obedience, refusal was unthinkable. It was not just pain they endured, it was humiliation. They were stripped not only of clothing but of dignity, forced to perform suffering like actors in a play with no ending. Some lords turned it into a tradition, held every year. Warriors competed not to win, but to outlast, to bleed more, to show less. Those who passed were often scarred for life. Some could no longer grip a sword. Others lived with disfigured hands, ruined eyes, or maimed backs. But they were praised, elevated, given titles. Their scars became trophies, medals carved into skin, and all of it was framed as honor, as if pain made loyalty more real. Behind the walls of those castles, power meant control. And there was no greater form of control than owning someone's pain. Lords watched these trials not just to see obedience, but to feel invincible. If a man would suffer so willingly, what wouldn't he do? The 100 Scars trial was not about proof. It was about domination, a silent war of wills played through flesh. Lords whispered of extending the trials, adding fire, water, ice, even insects. The creativity became a contest in itself. Who could invent the cruelest ritual that still passed as noble tradition? Who could break a man the furthest without killing him? And each time the samurai endured it, he made the system stronger. His silence fed the myth that suffering was noble, that obedience was glory. But inside many broke, not with screams, but with silence that followed them. Empty eyes, lifeless oaths, loyalty bought not with respect, but with agony and the memory of screaming behind closed doors. Some trials took hours, others days. The worst were done in phases. The warrior would endure one set of wounds, then be locked in a dark room for a night, forced to reflect, to fester, to sleep on stone. The next morning it resumed. More burns, more blood, more stares, and always the same question in the Lord's eyes. How far will you go for me? The final ordeal was often the drinking of scalding tea, sipped with trembling hands and split lips. It left the tongue blistered, the throat raw. If the samurai finished it, the trial ended. If not, another trial would begin. This cycle ensured that even survival brought no relief. It only led to deeper suspicion, closer scrutiny. The samurai became a living monument to his own torment. And yet others lined up for the honor. They bowed before the very system that carved them open, because in their world pain was purpose, and silence was survival. For those who passed the 100 Scars, glory was promised. They were elevated to higher ranks, given command, titles, land. But the reward was hollow. Many lived with shaking hands, unable to sleep without nightmares. They wore long sleeves not out of shame, but to hide their trauma from the younger warriors. They spoke little, drank heavily. Some ended their own lives months later, unable to reconcile honor with horror. Yet others became judges themselves, passed down the tradition, believing it purified weakness. They saw pain as a ladder. If they had suffered, others should too. The cycle fed itself, a chain of scarred men forging the next. And still the Lord smiled, their power unchecked, their games uninterrupted. No one dared call it cruelty. It was tradition. It was samurai virtue. And in that twisted belief, the trial endured. Through generations, through silence, through blood. A game of pain hidden behind the mask of honor. Outside the warrior caste, commoners whispered rumors of the trials. They called them demon rituals, said those who returned from them walked like ghosts. Women warned their sons not to become samurai. Mothers lit incense to keep the spirits of the trial victims away. But nothing changed. The daimyos ruled with unchecked power, and the samurai upheld that power with unquestioning loyalty. The 100 Scars trial was not officially recorded. No scrolls described its exact procedures. No edicts sanctioned it. But it was real, passed in whispers, memorized by generations of warriors. Its rules varied, but its message remained the same. Prove your loyalty through pain, or lose your place. In some castles, it became initiation. In others, punishment, always brutal, always quiet. The official histories of Japan do not speak of it, but the scars remained, etched into flesh, buried under armor. A secret history of torment beneath the polished code of honor. The Squid Game of the shoguns. The 100 Scars trial faded with the fall of the samurai class. When the Meiji Restoration swept through Japan, it dismantled the feudal system and stripped the lords of their power. Modernization brought with it a rejection of the old ways. But the pain lingered. Survivors died in silence. Their children never knew the full truth. Yet some fragments remained, ink drawings of men kneeling in gardens, anonymous scrolls detailing rituals, and rare accounts whispered into shrines. Historians dismissed them as folklore, too extreme, too shameful, but others believed, not because of the documents, but because of the scars. Preserved armor stained dark from blood, bone fractures sealed with primitive binding. The body does not lie, and what it remembers is a truth too brutal to put in textbooks. The 100 Scars trial was never declared. It didn't need to be. It was passed hand to hand, blade to blade, scar to scar. A legacy carved in pain. In the end, the 100 Scars trial was not a ceremony. It was a trap, a performance forced on those who had no choice. If you refused, you were a traitor. If you submitted, you became complicit. It asked samurai to surrender not just their bodies, but their humanity. It blurred the line between loyalty and torment, between honor and horror. And once inside the ritual, there was no clean way out. The scars lasted longer than the applause. The titles faded, the pain didn't. It was a game designed by those with power, inflicted on those with pride. A ritual that turned warriors into puppets and pain into proof. Today, the world remembers the samurai for their discipline, their code, their elegance. But beneath the surface lies a secret history of fire, blood, and silence. Of a game with no prize, only scars. A game that demanded everything and gave nothing back but pain. Chapter 7. The King's Game of Lies. The Tudor Betrayal Gauntlet. In Tudor England, no battlefield was more treacherous than the royal court. Power shifted like sand underfoot. Friends turned overnight into enemies. A whisper could become a noose, and the most dangerous game wasn't played with swords or fire, but with silence, secrets, and smiles. In the reign of Henry VIII, betrayal became ritual. Nobles, wives, advisors, and rivals were all drawn into a psychological gauntlet where loyalty had no meaning and survival had no rules. At the center of this web stood Anne Boleyn, queen, reformer, and target. Her rise had broken kingdoms. Her fall would shatter lives. But she was not alone in this game. Every figure around her was playing a part, some to protect, others to destroy. It was a contest without clear beginnings, a drama written in ink, blood, and the cold steel of execution. This wasn't politics, it was performance. One mistake, one wrong alliance, and you didn't just lose favor. You lost your head. And Boleyn's enemies were not just across the Channel or in Rome. They were within arm's reach, advisors in velvet cloaks, maids with eager ears, and noblemen with hidden blades of ambition. Henry VIII's court was a place where no oath could be trusted. Men who smiled during dinner would later sign arrest warrants by candlelight, and all of it unfolded under the illusion of civility. Behind embroidered curtains and golden goblets, there were conspiracies. Alliances shifted like wind. To stay alive was not enough. You had to anticipate treachery before it breathed your name. And, brilliant and defiant, had many who envied her. Her wit, her influence, her role in reshaping England's church. But the crown made her vulnerable. Her power inspired plots. And in the game she was forced to play, the rules changed daily. Today's ally was tomorrow's executioner. Every word mattered. Every silence more so. One misstep meant ruin. One misread glance could open the trapdoor beneath your feet. Henry VIII was not just king, he was the game master. Paranoid, impulsive, and obsessed with control. He demanded loyalty not just in action but in appearance. A raised brow could be misread as rebellion. A missed greeting could trigger suspicion. And Boleyn learned this too late. While Henry's attention wandered toward Jane Seymour, courtiers circled like wolves. They knew Henry's heart was unstable, and where love faltered, heads fell. So they whispered. They fed him lies dressed as warnings. They planted traps wrapped in concern, and was accused of adultery, incest, treason, crimes so outrageous they mocked reality. But it didn't matter. In Henry's court, truth was just another pawn. Her downfall was a lesson for everyone. No matter your title, no matter your grace, the king could turn your world to ash in an instant. He didn't need proof, only a reason. And once he had it, the machinery of betrayal roared to life like a hungry beast. The Tower of London didn't echo with screams. It hummed with waiting. And it became the final stage of the game. Inside its walls, silence pressed in like a second skin. She was not alone. 5 men, including her own brother, were imprisoned too. All accused, all marked. Some had been loyal, some had not. But now it no longer mattered. The charges were written, the trials arranged, and the outcome was already chosen. The Gauntlet was not about justice. It was about spectacle. The courtiers watched, some in fear, some in triumph, and others in calculation, wondering who might fall next. Anne's enemies, like Thomas Cromwell, had played their cards well. They wove a web of lies so intricate that even the truth drowned. By the time Anne faced her accusers, the verdict was decided. Her only crime was being in the king's way. The betrayal wasn't a sudden blade. It was a slow suffocation under smiling faces and polished lies. Even in death, Anne became part of the game. Her execution was staged not just as punishment, but as theater. The crowd was invited. The sword imported. Every step was planned to send a message. Loyalty was conditional, and power was rented, not owned. After Anne's death, the courtiers who once served her shifted to Jane Seymour without hesitation. New alliances formed before the blood dried. Old friendships vanished like breath in winter. But the betrayal didn't stop with Anne. It was only the beginning. Thomas Cromwell, once the architect of her fall, would find himself accused and executed within a few years. Jane Seymour died in childbirth. Even those closest to the king eventually fell out of favor. No one was safe. Henry's court was a revolving wheel of loyalty and loss. Those who survived longest were not the boldest, but the quietest. The ones who mastered the game of silence, who knew when to flatter and when to disappear. There were no winners, only survivors. The courtiers who remained learned to speak in riddles, to hide their thoughts behind half-smiles and cautious nods. Every meeting, every meal became a performance. The court was a palace of mirrors, where nothing was what it seemed. People practiced their facial expressions like armor. Tears were rehearsed, betrayals planned with the same precision as banquets. Even marriages were weapons. A daughter given to the right family could buy months of safety. A missed birthday could cost your career. This wasn't paranoia, it was survival. The gauntlet extended beyond the tower, beyond the courtroom. It was in the corridors, the chapels, the gardens. At any moment, you might hear your name whispered in a hallway and know the trap had been set. The most terrifying part? You wouldn't even know why. That was the genius of Henry's court. It didn't just punish enemies. It broke loyalty by turning everyone into a potential betrayer. The women of the court played their own deadly version of the game. Queens were pawns, yes, but also players. Each tried to secure favor not just for themselves but for their families. Mothers groomed daughters like weapons. Wives became spies. Maids passed letters under doors and listened at keyholes. And Bullen had once been one of them. She knew the steps. She had danced the dance. And she had won. Until she lost. After her death, other women learned different strategies. Be docile, be fertile, be silent. But even these rules offered no safety. Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, would be accused of adultery and executed. Catherine Parr, his sixth, only survived by outliving him. They had played well, but none walked away untouched. The game did not spare the innocent. It merely took longer to break them. For women, the gauntlet was double-edged. Survive the king's attention, but don't keep it too long, or risk becoming the next name etched in stone. The men, meanwhile, schemed through ink and conversation. Letters sealed with wax carried promises, betrayals, and threats. Courtiers aligned themselves like chess pieces. If one bishop rose, another fell. If one noble gained land, another vanished. The moment a man gained the king's favor, others plotted his fall. It was not personal. It was the game, and the only way to win was not to stand still. Even Thomas More, beloved and principled, found himself in the path of Henry's will. Refusing to endorse the king's supremacy over the church, More chose principle over survival. And so, he too became a piece discarded. The court devoured idealists. It rewarded shadows, men who smiled without blinking, who answered every question with another, who knew that loyalty was currency, and that truth was always negotiable. They didn't want to win. They wanted to endure. And endurance meant learning when to bow, when to vanish, and when to lie with grace. It wasn't always the most clever who survived. Sometimes it was the most forgettable. The quiet ones, the background players. They lasted longer than the bold. Fame painted a target. Silence offered camouflage. Henry's court was like a stage that punished actors who spoke too loudly. The survivors weren't necessarily strong or brilliant. They were observant, invisible, skilled in the art of seeming harmless. Some wrote no letters, made no alliances, simply drifted between rooms like ghosts. They watched friends rise and fall. They buried secrets deeper than gold. And they counted days like coins, knowing one misstep would empty the vault. For these players, there was no victory, only continuation. They weren't remembered, but they lived. And in Henry's England, that was the rarest prize of all. The court became a graveyard for the ambitious and a quiet refuge for the cautious. The game was endless, and sometimes the only way to win was never to play at all. But even Henry, the architect of this grand deception, was not immune. As he aged, paranoia consumed him. He trusted no one. His wives changed, his counsel shifted, his body failed. Yet he played the game until the end. His last years were haunted by shadows of betrayal, some real, some imagined. The man who once held the fates of nations in his hands now feared the whispers behind curtains. He had created a kingdom built on fear and lies, and now it surrounded him. He had taught his subjects to betray, and so they did. He had demanded silence, and so no one dared speak the truth. When Henry finally died, England exhaled. But the gauntlet he built did not disappear. It lived on in successors, in policies, in traditions. The Tudor court became a model of control by manipulation, a place where the greatest power was not force, but deception. And it all began with a king who turned paranoia into politics. The Tudor betrayal gauntlet was a squid game of the mind. No knives, no iron. Only masks, lies, and traps. It wasn't about survival of the strongest, but the most adaptable, the most forgettable, the most deceitful. What made it terrifying was its elegance, its quiet, its logic. It punished the honest and rewarded the hollow. And Bullen's fall was only the opening act. Dozens followed, dozens fell. And still they kept playing, because in that world, playing meant breathing. Standing still meant death. It wasn't blood that stained the floors of Hampton Court. It was fear. It lingered in the hallways. It echoed in the portraits. It whispered in the silence between footsteps. The gauntlet never really ended. It just changed names, changed faces. And long after the Tudors faded, the game of power through betrayal lived on, in palaces, in parliaments, in every room where survival demands a mask. A lesson etched in history, a game that never stopped.